That's the good news.
Yes. Thank you very much. So I'm here to talk about the polar bear catastrophe that never happened, but of course that began because the polar bear has been an icon for global warming for almost 2 decades. We're told repeatedly that the Arctic is warming 2 to 3 times the rate of the rest of the world, and that the polar bear is the canary in the coal mine for climate change. In September 2000, Time magazine in the US proclaimed that the Arctic meltdown was coming and that polar bears and the rest of us were in grave danger. By April 2006, using an image of a polar bear stranded on an ice floe, it proclaimed that the globe was warming dangerously fast and that we should all be very worried. Now, concerns about polar bear survival, polar bear conservation have been around for so long that it's probably difficult for most people to remember how it all began and what exactly has happened. But it is important, I think, to remember that there was a change that happened from the bear being considered threatened because of overhunting to being threatened by climate change, and that distinction came in the blink of an eye. So just to give you a historical perspective, the IUCN Polar Bear Specialist Group, now the IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. In the late 1960s, they developed what they were calling a red list of threatened and endangered species. And as part of that new organization, they put together this polar bear specialist group whose job was to coordinate the conservation of polar bears because their numbers had declined to dangerous levels, and there was, in fact, real concern that the bear might face extinction. So one of the things that the Polar Bear Specialist Group did was to help broker an international treaty in 1973 amongst all the nations in the Arctic that had polar bears within their boundaries. And this was to protect the bear from further rampant overhunting. However, it wasn't until 1982 that the bear was formally classified as vulnerable to extinction based on some of the preliminary population assessments that had been done. And in fact, the bear kept at that status until 1996, when it turned out that the bear numbers had virtually doubled in all of the populations in which it was studied, and it was considered to, the status level was dropped to lower risk, which is now called least concern. So in fact, 1996 is the year that the polar bear was saved, but very few people heard about it. It wasn't something that was publicized. And the polar bear kept that status, in fact, for 10 years. And it became apparent, however, that the members of the Polar Bear Specialist Group were not particularly pleased to have their species of concern demoted, and they worked very hard to find another criteria that would boost it back up to a vulnerable level. And in 2006, they used the sea ice models that were coming out of climate change to suggest that in another 30 years, that they felt it was likely polar bear numbers would decline drastically. And as a consequence, the IUCN accepted their recommendation to boost the status designation backed up to vulnerable based on that recommendation. And it's important to keep in mind that, in fact, there was no scientific assessment or analysis done. It was purely a kind of show of hands, an opinion of the members of this polar bear specialist group. And interestingly, when the IUCN publicized the new list of animals that had been elevated to endangered or threatened species or vulnerable species in 2006, the two animals that they chose to highlight were the polar bear, whose status of vulnerable was based on a projection and in fact a prophecy of something that might happen in the future, and the common hippo that had actually suffered a 95% decline in population in the Congo. And this was the first time, in fact, that this had ever been done, that basing a status assessment on a future prediction, especially one based on climate change, had never been done by the IUCN or anyone else. And the other thing that's important to remember is that the distinction that we see here between the polar bear and the hippo was very confusing to the public at the time, and it remains an issue of confusion, because the hippo had actually suffered a real decline, but the polar bear had not. And what we find even now is a lot of people in the public, in journalists, teachers, all kinds of people who truly do believe that there are only a few hundred to a few thousand polar bears left in existence, because that would be true for any other species that would be listed as vulnerable by the IUCN. Okay, so 1 year later, what we had is many of the same group of biologists, this time serving with the US Geological Survey, who actually put together a study that predicted that most polar bears in the world would be gone by 2050 because of sea ice loss. Now, this model actually used a particular kind of structure called a Bayesian network model that allowed opinions to be used in place of facts. Now, one of the reasons that this was necessary was because, in fact, sea ice had never declined to the kinds of levels that polar bears were, or the scientists were projecting. So the biologists really did not have any observations on how the bears would respond. They had to use their best guess. They had to make some assumptions. And one of the things that they did in their models was to focus exclusively on summer sea ice change. Now, the reason that this was critical was because summer sea ice was the only season that was predicted to see a dramatic decline in ice. Fall, winter, and spring ice projections were small to insignificant, and therefore the focus became on summer sea ice, whether the changes were biologically relevant or not. So time passed, went through the US Endangered Species List process. In May 2018, the bears were duly classified as threatened on the US Endangered Species List, and that's a threat level that's pretty comparable to vulnerable by the Red List. And there was massive media coverage, and everyone in the world knew that the polar bear was threatened with extinction by climate change. Now, the model that was used some sea ice predictions based on climate models that came to particular conclusions for mid-century, for at 2050. And this map is one that was included in the US government reports for the prediction of what the ice would be like at mid-century. And this is a map that was produced for a climate assessment report in 2005. This, in fact, is the same report that was used by the Red List folks. So they were all looking actually at these 2005 sea ice predictions. And the biologists concluded that, in fact, when sea ice declined to this level that was expected at 2050, that a massive decline in polar bear numbers was inevitable. Specifically, their predictions for the polar bears was that 2/3 of the bears were predicted to disappear when summer sea ice dropped below 5 million kilometers square in 8 out of 10 years. And that constituted about a 42% decline from 1979 levels. And this meant, in real terms, a loss of about 16,400 bears. That was down from the total number that they were using of 24,500, down to only about 8,100. Now, interestingly enough, that would have been less than the number of bears that were thought to have existed in the 1960s. In geographical terms, what this meant was that all of the bears that lived in the purple and the green areas on this map were predicted to be extirpated. They would be gone completely. That would be 10 out of the 19 populations that were designated throughout the Arctic. However, there was a problem, and that was that the sea ice in September of 2007 dropped to a level that was not expected until 2050. And here is on the left, there is a map of what the sea ice looked like at the minimum extent in 2007. And on the right is a map of a graph of the 10 predictions of sea ice that were projected for 2050, with the red line showing the sea ice level at September 2005. And what it's showing is that the level at 2007 was less than 5 out of the best predictions for mid-century. Now, we know that Stephen Amstrup and his colleagues at the USGS knew that this was a problem even before the ink was dry on their report, because in their report that was released in early September, they included a very similar map that's dated August 23rd, and with a very similar graph that went with it. Now, their explanation for what this meant was that because the ice was clearly declining faster than predicted, that it was very likely that their predictions for how polar bears would respond would be very conservative, in that either the bear numbers would decline sooner than expected, or that the decline would be much more pronounced. Now, a couple of years later, an important sea ice paper came out that actually solidified this impression that, in fact, sea ice had dropped to these 2050 levels. And this was by Wang and Overland in 2009. And what they concluded was that September ice minimum for 2007 and 2009 had come at least 30 years earlier than expected. And they concluded that an ice-free summer by 2040 was very likely. And so this dramatic loss of sea ice that was coming earlier than expected was in fact public knowledge known by sea ice biologists and also by polar bear biologists by between 2007 and 2009. However, what turned out to happen was that the ice decline did not get worse over time. It actually stabilized. And we see this in the sea ice maps that are produced. that in fact the sea ice has been at 2050 levels ever since 2007 and going up to 2016. And just to show you, if we continue that, that in fact the levels for 2017 and 2019 fit the same pattern. And very conveniently for me, just this September, the National Snow and Ice Data Center produced this graph for their assessment for the September ice report. And what it shows is that the steepest part of the decline, in fact, occurred between 1999 and 2012, but that since 2007, there has been no trend in sea ice. So, the sea ice people concur that there has been a decline in ice that has been pretty steady. It's been stable at about 2050 levels since 2007. It's not just my interpretation. However, what we've discovered is that polar bear numbers did not decline as predicted. This is just a graph of the sea ice decline for September since 1979. The arrow is marking 2005 when the initial sea ice predictions and the polar bear assessments were made. And what we're seeing is the sea ice indeed went down to 2050 levels, but polar bear numbers went up. Now, they did not go up by a huge amount, but it was certainly not a two-thirds decline. In other words, the models were spectacularly wrong. Not only the sea ice models, but also the polar bear survival models. And what we're faced with now in terms of current conditions are fat, healthy polar bears throughout the Arctic and much less summer sea ice than in 1979. And I think this is an appropriate time to talk about the propaganda tool of starving polar bears that often comes up in the media in order to try and make an emotional impression on people and to get them on board. In 2017, National Geographic used images like this and a video. And what they did was labeled this, the particular frame on the right saying, this is what climate change looks like. This video went viral. Apparently it was viewed more times than any other video that National Geographic has ever produced. However, they soon had to retract the statement and apologized because, in fact, it wasn't true. Bears starve when they're sick or injured. Young, inexperienced bears and old, weak bears have trouble catching seals, and also they have trouble defending them from bigger, stronger bears. Overall, starvation is actually the leading natural cause of death for polar bears, which means you're always going to find a few bears in a population at any time that look like they're starving. And that means that a single starving bear doesn't tell you anything about the population health of the polar bears. Now, if what these people were filming were dozens of starving bears, that would be a different story. But a photo of a single starving bear really means nothing. So why were the models so wrong? It's important to sort of pick this apart. And the first one is that it turned out that summer hunting was much less important than the biologists assumed in their models. You can see this little clip from a BBC video of a polar bear trying to catch a bearded seal in summer where there's lots of open water around the sea ice, and the seal has no problem escaping. And that's the problem that most polar bears face in the summer, even if they spend the time out in the sea ice. They might try and hunt, but they're very rarely successful. And the other part of this was that it turned out that less ice in the summer was beneficial to the seals. What the seal biologists discovered was that the seals do most of their hunting, most of their feeding, in the ice-free period. So if they have a longer ice-free period, they've got a longer time to feed, to get fat for the coming winter, to give birth to healthy cubs or pups the next spring, which are the food for polar bears. So that was a bit of a surprise. You know, I would argue that it shouldn't have been a surprise for them, but nevertheless, it was not something that was included in their models, but subsequent research has shown that this is in fact the case. The other factor was kind of a corollary of this, and that is that spring hunting turned out to be much more important. Now, spring hunting wasn't included in the survival models because the biologist included only summer criteria. However, because spring hunting is so much more critical, it means that spring sea ice conditions were much more important than they gave them credit for, which meant that some of the evidence that we have historically from the literature of thick spring ice conditions in the Beaufort Sea, for example, and also probably in Hudson Bay, that have had devastating effects on polar bear populations that then get mistaken for summer ice loss effects. And that is where thick ice in spring conditions on a few occasions are documented in the literature, and that's where you get dozens of starving bears all at the same time. And that's in the literature, and that is irrefutable. Now, I wrote up my analysis of this work, and I put it in the form of testing a hypothesis that the polar bear biologist had proposed. I was not able to get it through the peer review process because of the biases that are present. However, it is published online in PeerJ preprints, which actually has an online review process. So anyone who's willing to sign their name to it can in fact go in and review this paper. None of the polar bear biologists have bothered to do so. And I would suggest that hypothesis testing is the appropriate format for presenting a scientific criticism such as this. And in fact, you don't have to put a collar on a polar bear to assess whether a prediction that was published in 2007 matched up with documented observations taken since then. I don't do field work in the Arctic, but I do have 25 years of experience reading scientific papers and reports critically and comparing them to modern reports. However, in November of 2017, I woke up to find a very critical paper promoted by media outlets across the world. It was called Internet Blogs, Polar Bears, and Climate Change Denial by Proxy. Now, there's 14 co-authors on this paper that was published in the journal Bioscience, and I only recognized 5 of them. Ian Sterling is Canada's leading polar bear biologist. Stephen Amstrup is the fellow from USGS who was instrumental in putting together that polar bear prediction. Michael Mann, a climate scientist who thinks very highly of himself. Stephen Lewanowski, an Australian psychologist, and a biologist by the name of Eric Post, whose name I've come across on occasion in the literature. I don't recognize the names of any of the others. None of them, including the lead author, Jeff Harvey, have actually published any work on polar bears. That most of their claim to fame in terms of this topic is predictions of a coming mass extinction. So nothing to do with polar bears in particular. Now, this was an attempt to silence legitimate scientific criticism. There was no effort made in this paper to address any of the criticisms that I'd made about what polar bear conservation and what polar bear biologists had been doing. Really, the claim was that falsely suggesting that I was misrepresenting and putting false statements on my blog, and then making it possible for other blogs on the internet to pick that up and use me as an authority. So the other blogs on the internet were sort of plastered with a bad name, but I was singled out for humiliation. And really turned out to be a very vindictive attack, meant to publicly discredit me, and the media went along. There were local and international reports saying very much the same thing. Very few of them contacted me for comment. They just slathered on the denier claim, including the New York Times. But meanwhile, my university was busy doing some silencing of its own. By the time the Harvey paper came out, I'd already been expelled from the university's Speakers Bureau. Now, this was a volunteer organization that really coordinated public lectures in the community, and I had been giving lectures on evolution and polar bear conservation to adult audiences since 2009. In 2016, I had added a polar bear talk specifically for school children because teachers kept asking me if I would do so. And in May of that year, I was refused to continue the following year, and it was claimed that my talks to these school children lacked balance, even though I was not aware of any complaints registered by students, teachers, or parents. And when I pressed the university for a further explanation, they would not answer. So this became my academic hanging without a trial that was conducted behind closed doors. Really, I got virtually nothing in way of answers. And this summer, my department refused to renew my adjunct professor status, a position I'd held for 15 years, and they did not say why. They would put nothing in print. The university has refused to answer questions from a journalist about what exactly went on. In just 4 weeks ago, there was a piece in the National Post newspaper in Canada detailing as much as possible what went on, but really there has been no further details released by the university. Now, it's pretty clear to me that really what this boils down to is that adjunct professors have no rights. It's an unpaid position. It really is there for a bit of mutual benefit from both sides. But clearly, in this case, the action that they took was legal, but it was an unethical attack, nevertheless, on my academic freedom. And yet, here I am. I'm not about to be silenced. I'm still talking to you about why polar bears didn't die off as predicted, and I plan to continue to do so. But one final question that I think still needs to be asked, and that's how many polar bears are really out there? I've noticed that polar bear specialists from the Polar Bear Specialist Group have been minimizing estimates of the global polar bear population for decades. And this is the same sea ice graph that I've showed earlier. And what the polar bear biologists seem to be suggesting is that since the 1960s, when the polar bear numbers were, somewhere around 10,000, that the numbers went up until about 1995 or 96, and then have leveled off ever since. And I would suggest to you that this is biologically implausible, and that it's very likely that, in fact, the numbers have continued to increase, and that we're just not seeing it, partly because some of the populations have not been surveyed, and that we don't have concrete numbers for them. And what the biologists are doing is really lowballing their estimates for those populations. So I would contend then that a plausible scientific estimate at about 2018 is around 39,000, with a fairly broad range of 26,000 to 58,000. Now, I base this using a kind of geographical model of extrapolation, looking at populations within one region that have had a recent and fairly decent scientific assessment or estimate, and then using that to extrapolate for some of the populations in Russia and for East Greenland, for instance, that have never been surveyed. So that's the kind of number I came up with. And you know, some people have suggested to me that, gee, maybe this is a little outrageous. But in fact, one of the things that I've come across is that in 1986, Canadian polar bear specialist Ian Sterling stated there was probably about 40,000 bears in the world, using exactly the same criteria I did. If you made a decent estimate for the areas that had not had a survey, and use that to come up with a global total. And in fact, if his estimate was true in 1986, 39,000 as the current average, with a potential for 58,000 maximum, is likely a conservative estimate after more than 30 years. And I contend that, in fact, there is no climate emergency for polar bears. The canary in the coal mine for climate change turned out to be an outstanding survivor of climate change. But what does this mean for Arctic residents? There's some real repercussions. There is more polar bears now in the Arctic than there has been in 50 years. And what we're seeing is that these dangerous predators are killing people, and they're doing, in fact, a lot of damage that we never hear of in the media in their relentless quest for food. They will damage these snow machines. They've gotten attraction for anything vinyl. They'll rip up things. They'll kill dogs and dog teams, and even fat polar bears will kill people and damage property. And what it means is that polar bears are actually now a danger year-round. It used to be maybe only in the summer. Now we're seeing the population so high that bears are starting to visit communities virtually every month of the year. And just to give you an example of some incidents that I found in the media around Svalbard in fairly recent years, in July of 2018, you may have remembered hearing about a tour guide that was attacked by an emaciated polar bear on a remote island in the Barents Sea. And this fellow was a polar bear guard. He was there to search out the beach to make sure there was no polar bears so that tourists could come ashore to look at birds. But he was ambushed by this bear, even though he had a gun, and it was only because his partner who had a gun was right there that he avoided being seriously mauled or killed. In August 2016, an archaeological site on one of the islands had to stop for pretty much all day as a couple of polar bears had a good look around to see what was going on. In another incident, in a remote cabin, a polar bear just ripped off the door of the cabin by its hinges and then ransacked the interior. And this is an incident from this summer, where a couple of fellows were just going out for cruising around, and they stopped to have lunch on the beach and go for a bit of a walk. When they looked back, they saw this bear had climbed into their boat, and this is what he did to the interior. Now, like so many of these incidents, it was blamed on climate change in the media, blamed on a lack of sea ice due to climate change. But in fact, like most of these stories, when you look at the specific sea ice conditions at the time, it just doesn't hold water. And it turns out that the ice around Svalbard this summer has been higher than it's been in decades. And so blaming this particular incident on lack of sea ice seems a little ludicrous. Okay, so that's really wrapping it up, and just some points to remember. And that is that summer sea ice is not crucial for polar bear health and survival. Less sea ice in summer is beneficial to ringed and bearded seals, which are the primary prey of polar bears. And that since 2005, even though sea ice dropped to levels not predicted to occur until 2050, polar bear numbers did not plummet as expected. Polar bear population numbers are the highest they've been in 50 to 60 years. And since 2005, polar bear specialists have repeatedly underestimated the global population size. The current global population size may be as high as 39,000, but officially is still 26,000. And thriving polar bear populations put the safety of Arctic residents and visitors at risk. Now, some people object to me telling children that polar bears are not currently on the brink of extinction, even though this is undeniably true. Bears are thriving. Whatever polar bear biologists say what might happen in the future is in fact a totally separate issue. Despite summer sea ice loss, there is no climate emergency for polar bears, and given the emphasis on Arctic amplification and the expectation for a catastrophe in the Arctic, I would also contend that no climate emergency for polar bears means there's no climate emergency, period. Now, I've written up the details of this polar bear catastrophe that never happened in my newest book. Unfortunately, the plan that I had to have books available here today didn't play out. But all of these are available on Amazon. The polar bear catastrophe book has all references in it. It's in English, but is available in paperback and ebook. The Polar Bear Facts and Myths was a book that I put together for children age 7 and up that's been very popular, that's got information about bears that won't scare children to death, and it has been translated into German, and that you can get online as well. And then one thing that I did do, though, is that I made up some stickers that shows that polar bears are thriving in 7 European languages. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, so war ja erschöpfend erklärt, oder? Keine Fragen mehr? Okay, bitte.
Thank you very much for your speech. There's perhaps another confirmation for your claim. We had a temperature peak 130,000 years before present. There, the temperatures were much higher than today. One found bones of hippos on the Rhine and also on the Thames in London. And it is not known that at these times the ice bears, the polar bears, had vanished or had extinction. That is not known. I believe that is a good argument for you if you are speaking with children, to remember children that the temperature is changing, that we have ice times and that we have warm times. And as I said, 130,000 years ago, the polar bears existed and survived.
Yes. Well, and that's a good point, because the estimates for when polar bears arose as a distinct species range between about 400,000 to 600,000. And there's a number of reports that have been made, and they all come up with a slightly different answer. But even if we consider that the bears arose at about 350,000 years ago, that would have been during a glacial period, then what we see is that they had to have survived 2 warm interglacials that were warmer than today, when there would have been no sea ice in the Arctic in the summer. Now, we don't know precisely how they survived during those periods and whether or not their populations dropped or not. But what we do know is that they survived to the present.
Lady, please, tell me, how do you count bears? How?
How do you count bears?
How?
Well, yes. Well, it is very difficult, and there are a number of ways to do it. In some areas of the Arctic where the bears come ashore during the summer, they often count by a survey or a grid of airplane surveys. So they do it from the air. In one of the Russian surveys was done from a ship. In other instances, what they do is capture the bears in the spring, put a collar on the females, and then the next year they capture bears again to see how many of those they've put a collar on have come back. Now, all of these methods come with really important assumptions. That, for example, that if a bear is collared and doesn't come back, that it's died, for instance, when in fact it could have just come ashore somewhere else, out of reach. So, I mean, the truth is that the counting of these bears has been fraught with difficulties. One of the things that is apparent is that virtually every count that has been done has used a slightly different method, which means it's very difficult to compare one year to another. And we're now suffering through a period of really quite an extreme lag. There are 2 subpopulations in the Canadian Arctic, for example, that the population count was finished in the summer of 2017. We still don't have those reports. So, you know, there certainly is some difficulties there, even in trying to get the scientific assessments. Okay.
Ms. Crockford, I learned a couple of years ago that 1,000 years ago, during the medieval warm period, the Arctic has been ice-free for about centuries. Doesn't that stress you, because the polar bear did not die out then?
Yeah, yes, absolutely, yes. And if
just
yes.
1,000 years ago,
Yes.
if the ice would have affected the polar bear, he would be gone by now, wouldn't it?
Yes, and that's true. And yet, what we really don't know, and I'll emphasize this, is whether or not the population dropped and then went back up again. And that's what we don't know. And in fact, when one tries to bring up these historical events, it's one of the things that the polar bear biologists emphasize, is that, you know, there's not enough detail about how the bears responded to be useful in assessing how they might behave in the future.
Hello, Ms. Crockford. Thank you for the presentation. You said that polar bears are also very dangerous to people. So some Inuits, or how do you call them, I don't know, live in the Arctic area as well. So how do they deal with the danger of the ice bear?
That's a good question, because one of the things that happens is that because over the last few decades, the bear numbers have been down, many people in the Arctic have, I think, got a bit complacent. They've gotten used to, going hunting and fishing on the landscape without really having to worry about encountering polar bears too much. And I think they're really realizing now that that time has come to an end, that really they cannot any longer go out without a gun at all times. And Canada, there were 2 deaths, really tragic deaths of young men last summer. And one of them where a man actually had to get between a bear and his children in order to protect them. And he had unfortunately left his gun on the boat. And not only did the bear kill him, it actually started eating him before people came to the rescue, and his children had to watch that. So I think it's becoming then a new reality for people who live and work in the Arctic, that they're really going to have to take these kinds of measures seriously and take the threat of the bear seriously.
Hinweis technischer Art. Die Fragen können Sie auf Deutsch stellen. Wir haben da hinten 3 Damen, die ich noch gar nicht vorgestellt habe. Erstmal herzlichen Dank für die Arbeit. Wer darauf geachtet hat, wir haben heute Abend, dieses Mal, 3 Dolmetscherinnen im Einsatz, nicht nur 2, weil das, was wir machen, grenzt sonst an Folter. Okay, was anderes nochmal. Sie dürfen auf Deutsch Ihre Frage stellen, gar kein Problem, und das wird gedolmetscht und Dr. Crockford hört es dann sofort. Okay, da hinten.
Hallo, ich nutze das Angebot gleich mal auf Deutsch. Can you understand?
No.
Okay, in this case
not
I
getting-
have to ask in English.
Okay. Give this. Yeah.
We do it just because we can do it.
Okay, go ahead.
Let's try. Hören Sie mich jetzt auf Englisch?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Prima. Sie waren ja 25 Jahre lang an der Universität von Victoria und haben doch bestimmt auch eine Menge persönliche Freunde und Bekanntschaften dort. Und wie erklären Sie sich das, dass diese Leute Sie so eiskalt vor die Tür setzen, ohne irgendein Wort, alles hinter den Kulissen, hinter den Türen? Wie haben die das Ihnen gegenüber gerechtfertigt? Oder gab es überhaupt irgendeinen persönlichen Kontakt, der sich erklärt hat?
No, there wasn't any personal contact. And it was something that I found disturbing, that none of my colleagues, in fact, came forward and talked to me about what had gone on. And one of the things that I've said that I found particularly disturbing is that when I came to the anthropology department with a plan to do my PhD research on a particular area of evolution, looking at the speciation event, they embraced me with open arms, even though what I was proposing actually challenged the reigning evolutionary theory made by experts, both living and dead. So apparently, it was not only well and good to question those experts, it was encouraged, and they were very happy to have me there and do that. And now what we're seeing is that they're saying, but I may not question the authority of another polar bear biologist. So it really is confusing to me and upsetting that no one has talked to me about what's going on, that no one warned me that I was at risk, that some of these things were happening behind closed doors, and I can't explain why. Anyone else?
Wow,
Okay.
we made it.
Okay.
Thanks, Susan.
All
Thanks
right.
a lot.